now. It's May Day, so I just put that at the top there. Happy May Day, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with looking at our normal persistent links associated with it, which since I got the new webcam, I'm trying to figure out how best to adjust so that I'm actually facing forward most of the time as opposed to staring off in the screens. But I can't always do that as well as I should. So first thing to do is just kind of go through real quick. Numbers are in for May, or in for April, I should say. We had our largest month ever for total MRs associated with it, 1775. That's a great year. So it's the independence. You could argue that this should have been the July release for anybody who's US based, because it's 1775. It's 1776, I guess. So we could go up one more maybe. Anyway, so that was very encouraging from that perspective. On our average MRs, excluding per author, excluding community contributions, we did see a rise, not quite as much as maybe we had hoped, but still a rise from 8.55 to 8.93. That one's interesting because it's a little bit lower from the prediction perspective, but did fall within the error range that I kind of originally set out, kind of based on that one. So I think that was encouraging from that perspective. Actually, both fell in that way. And then the third persistent link we have is GitLab time to close S1s and S2s. And I don't know, Mech, if you updated this or if this is still last week's data.
Yeah, sure, I'll take it over. This is still last week's data. With Tanya here, kudos to her, helped me polish this up a little bit, because we found out that we should be looking at customer affecting bugs as a whole. And we added another chart. I don't see your sidebar here, Christopher. There's another chart added for all customers. Customer only all is 3 more. Yes, that's the one. So we had limited data on customer S1s, so we expand the scope. And I think it's the same trend here, that the numbers are increasing. We didn't have numbers in for this month yet. My goal is to actually try to automate this in a very boring MVC way, because it's a lot of work trying to export this and dice it in. Tanya has been doing some work. I'm not sure if she's ready to show yet, but essentially it's a template Google Sheet that we could just drop in the CSV and it just recalculates dynamically on the fly, and we get a sharp refresh every time we do a CSV export. So that has been ongoing on our side.
Are you ready, Tanya, or is that next week?
I have one that's working. Right now it's custom for the hypothesis 3 that I'm supposed to present today. But it would just take me a couple minutes after the meeting to update that, and then I can add a note.
Okay, all right.
I think next time is fine.
Next time's fine. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Do you want me to update the link to this page, Mac?
Yes, that's probably the better one to look at.
So that we don't. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to do this live. Just double check this here. The reason I'm double checking is because if I texted over the description but not the link itself, but it did actually do the right thing there. So just double checking that. Cool. All right. So that gets us through the first item of persistent links, status of action items and hypothesis. So
do you want me to go through number 3? I think that's the next one.
On. Yes.
Okay, let me share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, do you all see a chart? Perfect. Okay, so I wanted to just go through this really quickly and explain what these lines are. The black line here is merge requests per author, regardless of if the author is an individual contributor or a manager at the time. The red line is for people who are individual contributors at the time that the merge request was merged. And you can see it really closely follows the total line. The blue line at the bottom there is for managers, specifically people who are managers at the time that the merge request is merged. And it is much lower than individual contributors, but overall the number of managers are so low that it makes a very small difference in the overall trend. And then I did get data from Brittany about people who were hired as individual contributors and then were promoted to managers. So there's people like Dennis. And they did start out as some of the most productive people in the company, and their numbers did go down as over time they were promoted. But this is only about a dozen people. So again, it doesn't make a huge difference in the overall numbers. So I think my takeaways, and please validate these. Yes, managers are less productive. However, there are so few managers that it doesn't actually make a material difference in the overall trend.
Promoted managers particularly.
And yeah, promoted managers too. They're a dozen out of, I mean, it's less than 10% of the total population. It's not a huge number. And there is also a tab here for results. This is what the chart pulls from. So here's total. You can see the numbers here, the counts. For individual contributors, it's, I mean, again, the managers, it's about 10%, less than 10%. For example, this month it was 6.1%. A lot of managers aren't contributing at all, so their numbers aren't being included here. But of the managers who contribute, it's such a small number that it doesn't make a huge difference.
You didn't check the histogram on that. You just, I'm assuming, got the average. Like, I would be curious to know if anybody was like super prolific. So like if you see Stan's contribution numbers, they're pretty outrageous in a good way. But you know, because of that, you know, it's significantly impacting. And that's the only thing I would say is, if I understand the statistical argument, I was just curious more if we had any significant outlier from that perspective.
I didn't look at outliers. I tried not to look at individual people for this, and then said look at trend. I didn't want to call people out or be inspired to call people out. Yeah,
the reason I ask is because, like, if you had a 10-to-1, if you had two 10-to-1s, like the numbers make sense to me from an averages perspective. But if you had, say, two 10-to-1s that happened in around July of 2018 that they got promoted, that would explain a pretty dramatic shift from that perspective.
Yeah, and to make sure that I'm clear, the red line and the blue line, so the individual contributor line and the manager line, does include people who were promoted, but at the time they were one or the other, and they're sorted accordingly. But the green line is regardless of if they were an IC or manager at the time the merge request is merged. This is just all the merge requests.
Okay. So
I think this could be highlighted. I think it's validated, but I don't know that there's any action item that can be taken. I mean, are you just not going to promote people? You know?
Well, definitely we're going to promote people when it's appropriate to promote them. I was thinking more around the fact of the statistical, you know, how much does it statistically matter, right? Like, and it's less about that and more to be kind of aware of it from that perspective, I guess, is maybe the right way to put it. I'm trying to find the right level of green here. 2 from the bottom.
Sorry, I jumped in a few minutes in. Which hypothesis is this that we just covered?
This is hypothesis number 3.
Number 3. Okay. So I think to answer your question, Tanya, the way the hypothesis word is a little bit sort of like underspecified, because we're not talking about like the impact, the potential impact if this is true on our productivity numbers. Right. So we're saying we think this is true. We think people get promoted to management, they are less productive. But are we saying this is the reason why our productivity dipped in the other graphs or not?
I don't think that we can conclude that based on the small numbers of people who meet the criteria. Seems more like an overall trend.
Okay, so then I would propose to add at the beginning of the hypothesis, like, just to make it a little more clear, our overall productivity has declined because longer tenured IC employees population are still as productive, whereas manager population have gotten less productive. And what we're saying, it sounds like, is managers have gotten less productive, but that is not why our overall productivity has declined, because
Yeah,
it's a small percentage.
it seems like everyone has gotten less productive and managers have been swept up in that as well.
Okay. So then I would say we actually, you got the right answer, but I think we actually falsified this hypothesis as I just recently reworded it. So it flips from green to red, but that's still a good result. And then that helps justify why we can't determine what an intervention was. Because if it's green, it tells, yeah, there's definitely something that we should do, but we're in Swiss, there's not in this case. Does that make sense to everybody? I want to make sure I'm not like...
It makes sense to me. I don't know if I would ever, the veracity of a hypothesis doesn't always necessarily translate to an action item. Like, I don't know if I would necessarily, like, I understand why you want to change the wording so that it does this, but in a true hypothesis fashion, it's a hypothesis. If we get a result that's validated, but it's not something we can action on, that's actually an acceptable outcome in my book.
I think even the way it was originally worded, it would still be red, because the longer tenured IC employee population is not still as productive. That's the overall thing that we're investigating, right?
That's true. So there's a third result bullet here. Longer tenured ICs productivity also.
Yeah, in that graph, the chart, the red line and the green line, or sorry, the red line and the black line, the overall line and the IC line were very matched over the whole course of history.
Yeah, maybe it's a different way to say it. Right now, we're only promoting a subset of folks. If we ever got to a much more aggressive state of promotion, it would start affecting this line. Would be my like we validated the hypothesis that if you convert somebody from a more experienced, in this case, it wasn't statistically relevant because the number of population was 12 relative to the group, which is less than 10%. But if I think it'd be a lot more dominating factor if say it was 20 or 40%. Not that we would necessarily see that in this situation, but that is a possibility in an organization.
But you could make an argument that change actually has happened, right? Like in 2018, we did a lot of bottoms-up building and some top-down building, and then we learned in retrospect that it was more effective to build teams top-down. So we've been hiring outside managers earlier and putting people in interim positions earlier. So I think that actually has occurred, but I don't think it's anywhere near 20 or 40%, right? We're still, like, that change I just talked about was probably between 10 and 12% or something like that, because we still have pretty broad spans of control. So I'd say, yeah, like there's technically something there, but the information is like if it's plus or minus 2%, we have to take off our statistical hat and put on our business hat and just say, like, it's not worth spending time pulling on this thread.
Cool. That means we have number 7. Ratio of maintainers has dropped over time, which has negatively impacted our average MRs per author. We had that associated with number 5 and the fact that it was taking longer to merge. And this is actually me jumping on the sword again, week 2. Where I haven't had a chance to investigate this.
So if I may jump in, Virginia, this is a great hypothesis that cycle time would help us dramatically. So if you remember from our conversation, I was talking about determining where in cycle time we're spending so much effort. Having the breakdown in our cycle time algorithm to say this is how long the review cycle was would basically help us make a determination here. So this, in any case, while we're looking at it and Christopher will look at the data and we can discuss in the future, this is a great case for cycle time.
Cool. And then on hypotheses 8, Clement, did you have an update?
So this one I tried to evaluate a little bit more kind of what we were trying to achieve. It seemed like we're trying to figure out why longer tenured engineers are more productive than less tenured engineers. So I kind of broke it down to a few things that we can test. We can send a survey, but I'm not 100% sure what the purpose behind the hypothesis is. So it's hard for me to figure out whether there's something we really need to dive into deeper.
So if we found, my supposition is that if we found that the fact of the matter is that the onboarding is cumbersome or maybe non-existent, right? Like if you come up with your own methodology and you're continuing to use that methodology and it turns out that that's not an effective way to operate, then that may actually in turn, you're a remote employee, you don't have any feedback loop, consequently you're not necessarily seeing that result, right? So like that would just push us towards better training associated with things to say, hey, here's a way to be more effective, or at least you should consider this as part of your efforts associated with that.
I wonder if we could tailor this one around, can we graph the complexity of the product? So that's one of the things that developer mentioned, is that it is more complex today to contribute to the product than it was with a 25-person engineering team, which is, the longer tenure folks who've been around.
We could also potentially gauge like the time it takes people to do their first MR. I know we've started to do that for onboarding as a metric, but trace it back to older engineers and see how long it took for them to get started. That would be a potentially better representation of onboarding and how they ramped up faster.
Yeah. I'm a little resistant to the first MR because first MR isn't going to get us to, say 10 MRs per month, right? Like it's not it's not necessarily it's causal as I'd like it to be from that perspective. But I was trying to figure out if we could validate or invalidate the hypothesis before we were down the path of how we best solution it. You asked the question of what would we do with the information. I think what we do with the information is then figure out how best to, get people up to speed more quickly on being productive, which is more than just getting up people up to speed, right? It's getting up people up to speed and productive, right? Maybe it's the right way to put it.
Yeah, then
it's the same thing. I mean, if you're up to speed, I think it assumes productively because that's the productivity, because that's the job. Can I ask some questions? Like when we say less tenure, developers with less tenure come in, does that refer to them having less tenure at GitLab, which is, of course, they're a new developer, or does it mean we're hiring people that have less tenure in their career?
I'm updating it to reflect that, which is the way I interpret it was is at GitLab. So like a senior IC comes in, but they're still new to the company. Because one of the things that Clement and Dennis found was that ICs with over 2 years of experience, I think it was, actually were more productive, which I was really surprised by. I was like, gosh, it takes 2 years to get there. That's surprising. At least I thought it was surprising.
2 years at GitLab.
2 years at GitLab.
Okay. And then the different methodology thing, like what are we looking for here? What's an example of the different methodology? Because like the two things I could speculate on are like, yeah, you come on, you just don't know the code base. It's like 2 million lines of code. It just takes a while to learn that. And then also the only thing that's not really methodology. The thing that would strike at methodology is that we're measuring MRs. We have a culture, particularly a long-standing culture, of really doing small granular MRs and being very iterative. That is probably the main thing that new developers have to learn, if I were to speculate. And yeah, we've actually been doing that, and we've been seeing that have a positive increase on this average number. But are there other things that...
Yeah, as an example, if they're running GitLab on a small box prototype, I mean, I'm being somewhat theoretical here, but like if it turns out that our senior developers are running on a small box prototype versus using a cloud instance, it gives them quicker iteration. That could be a determining factor, right? Or they open up the MR right away and submit it upstream basically get the MR open as quickly as possible, even if it's in draft form, because they want to verify that they haven't broken anything else, rather than running the test locally as an example and running that parallel, things like that. Or it could be the opposite way, right, from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. So how about you, Clement, or maybe you, Dahlia? Like, do you have a sense of what people need to learn to be more like our 2-year tenured ICs, is I guess the way to specify it?
Yeah, I'll elaborate on kind of the complexity of the product. What I heard is that, by nature of being a monolith, there's so much more to learn, where people who came from a more services oriented, they feel that the expectation is that they can learn their service really well and get up to speed much faster. So that was one comment from, new engineers. And this was a senior person. So like they are capable, but just by factor of, how big our application is. It's a lot to consume quickly. So one of the things that we're doing on ops is talking about component ownership and how can we very well define the areas that the team needs to focus on. I'm curious if that's possibly a factor for other engineers around, in the other groups as well.
So simulating the microservices strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like it's a conversation we should talk about as we grow. We have more engineers and more lines of code, and we want to operate efficiently.
So I think that's actually a separate thing, right? Because again, that's not a methodology, but I do agree that's important. So I think there's almost a separate hypothesis here of like, people have too much surface area to learn quickly, and that's why they're slow to learn. And what we should do is sort of create synthetic microarchitectures just in the form of areas of the code that teams and individuals are responsible for, and therefore they don't have to think about anything outside that. And then separate from that, there's also methodology like work breakdown, small MRs, types of things Christopher mentioned, and other stuff that we could actually put as part of onboarding. Like, this is how you know how to be a developer, that's why we hired you. This is how to be a GitLab developer. Yeah, so then I would take your point and move it to this one.
If that makes us abandon 8 as a investigation hypothesis, that's not necessarily an outcome, but it is an outcome in regards to it. It is an option here if we want to focus more on number 9 as opposed to 8.
Well, I mean, the data would be, we may already have the data, because if you were to try to confirm this, you would say like, well, how many, what's the average MR by tenure? We've already collected that data, and we've shown that longer tenured employees do more MRs on average than short tenured employees. So we may be ready for an intervention on this one and just say, do something in the onboarding process to really be effective coaching people about how to break down work and how iterative we need to be. I mean, I can definitely say from a managerial perspective, Sid said our iteration value is going to challenge me. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. But sure enough, that turned out to be true. It's quite unusual to ship such small units of work, frequent reorgs, small process changes, much smaller than I've done in the past. So I could sympathize with engineers going through the same thing of like, that's an MR that's hardly doing anything. You know what I mean? I think like people like Clement, you probably have more of a ground truth on that, but I would say if people feel like if that's data they could falsify and we already have that data, then I could say we could jump to that intervention and try to do more onboarding around iteration, let's say, or other things.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be improvements we can do to help people do that shift in thinking about smaller merge requests. I know for me, a big part of my shift when I joined was when it was like, hey, the salary calculator, it works. It's not perfect. It's not UX approved, but it makes improvement. So let's merge it. And then he merged it. So that was really big for me in understanding what iteration really is.
So like with the data about tenure, where was that? What hypothesis was that? Wow, 21 references to tenure in our
It was number 2.
I think it's 2. Okay, 2. So then I could just copy and paste this down and say, either from so this would imply to me that we've confirmed, at least for this one smaller MR's example, we've already demonstrated it, and we could actually identify an action to add to our onboarding. But would we want to keep this open? One, is that a good idea? And then 2, we do want to keep this open and look for other methodology things that are important.
So your philosophy is to really push on the smaller MRs aspect of it?
Well, that seems to be the methodology difference that we demonstrated, that we've got data to support. We accidentally collected it in another hypothesis.
We collected that they were more efficient at producing MRs. We didn't actually validate that that was smaller MRs in that data, did we?
We didn't compare the size of the merge requests.
Yeah, so it feels like maybe next step is to actually go through and see whether or not, you don't necessarily do it. If you do it for all, that's great. But if you want to do it for like, take 2 from the population of 2+ years and 2 from the population of say 3 to 6 months of tenure, and do a comparison of their lines of code or merge count associated with that. And if we see a dramatic difference between those, then that would be validation in my book. So I should be writing that down, which I guess you have as number 1, compare size of MRs by tenure.
Yeah. So then we're not ready for an intervention, but that's a good action.
Can be sampled, like I'm okay with. Well, on this one,
we'll do a manual count. We'll do a double blind, 2 manual counts, and we'll compare the results.
All right. Does that cover 8 and 9 well enough, or is there other aspects? Clement, do you feel like you have enough that you can run with it?
Yeah, I'll keep tackling 8. I'm not sure about 9 though.
Would this be, you're talking about graphing the complexity of the product. The other thing we do is we just ask people their impressions about learning it. But what would be your idea to graph the complexity of the product?
Dahlia dropped off, so it's going to be hard for her to answer that question. She had an interview, I believe. I like the idea of asking people.
It's cheap.
I wonder if what we do is a survey question, and survey question of ask how often you look up something when writing code or designing. Like it's kind of it's going to be a little bit of a hand wavy, but I'm just wondering if generally speaking, when I'm learning something and I'm trying to get more productive, rather than it being at the front of my memory, because I'm still trying to figure it out, I spend a lot of time I've got to go look at this reference, I got to go check this out, as opposed to just having it built into my head, whether it be the checklist to sign off for an MR or those aspects. But if other folks have better suggestions on what survey question to ask, or whether we should maybe just go interview a couple folks, that's the other option.
I like that, because I think the alternative suggestion is graphing the complexity of the product actually would mean taking the history of every developer and seeing which areas of the code that they touch, run it through k-means, and get a non-parametric answer to how many areas of the product are there, and then we name them, and then we turn that into an architecture or something like that. I think that's like a 7-year dissertation project for a PhD candidate, when we can just kind of get people's sense and chart something out. gets us to the same answer.
Okay. All right. I'll take an action to talk with Dahlia about that and see how we can best get some traction there from that perspective. Cool. So that's the hypothesis. Half an hour in, we're finally getting to the point where we can welcome folks to the group, as opposed to the beginning of the discussion. Sorry about that. Welcome Lyle and Virginia to the group. Mike has that listed below. And then also Mark, Remy, and Jason are also joining, though I didn't get them added early enough probably, so I'm guessing that's the reason why they're not here, but they're welcome as well in regards to adding them. When we expanded our charter, we added a bunch of more folks who will start showing up here. Mike, did you have anything to add?
Both Mark and Remy are on vacation, and I would expect Remy to be joining next week.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that in a second here. Cool. And then numbers for April are in. I haven't had a chance to do the OKR calculations just because they came in about 10:30 this morning. MRs per author is up again to 8.93. And also MRs, total MRs has gotten to 1775. So really, really good results from that perspective. And then I was just curious for feedback from the team of, at the risk of adding more work, is it better to have these issues and hypotheses tracked in a board, or do we like it in its current format from a document perspective? And I'll assume no feedback is...
We should dog food, huh? And use issues.
We are using issues to track things. We're just not using necessarily a board from that perspective. So the question is it better to track these as issues within the doc, or is it better to have a board associated with it?
I vote board.
Okay.
And then is that for each hypothesis is one, or does that mean each action item is one?
Hypothesis, exit criteria, and any other action items that we need to track in this form. Because don't forget, our charter expanded. Like, I was hoping to sneak out the door with exit criteria, and it turns out that we added a whole nother set of metrics we want to start basing things around.
Yeah, I agree with Tanya. When in doubt, dog food. On that note, Eric Brinkman reached out to me because I mentioned that we determined through the course of dog fooding on our management board that we would love to have cut lines, and turns out that got prioritized. So I think that's coming in the next release. So it works.
Do you like out of curiosity, do you like the two label way that you have to set up boards? I'm not a big fan of it.
The two label?
Yeah, so if you just want to have a board that's like for multiple projects and you want to bring in issues, you have to tag them first with a label to get them on the board, and then you have to have a separate one depending on which column you want it in associated with it. So you have an engineering one, and then I think you have VP of engineering, development director, or development department, each of the departments listed.
Yeah, so I actually I like how composable labels make boards personally. I do think it creates a lot of visual clutter. So I created an issue to actually, let me project so I'm not talking out of folks. So this is our engineering management board where myself and all the directors, different departments work. Every issue on this board needs to have engineering management. That's how it appears on the board. So I have an issue to just say, hide this issue from all of these things. Put a title of the board up here that says engineering management board, and just have something in parentheses about the scope that says has this label. And then these gray ones just kind of disappear. Then you could do the same for each column. Every issue in Christopher's column here has this orange development department label. Hide it from this column, but just put it up here, leave it right here as it is, just to imply that it's all here. And then if you want to see every issue, you can see it in the detail view or this preview, and you can see the complete list of labels on an issue. That makes sense to me, but product management it's not really flying for them. They want to create a button that either hides all labels or shows all labels. And I said, well, that, rather than a sensible default, you give me a button with two states, neither of which is terribly useful to me. Don't really like that, but I wanted to be sensitive, not pulling rank and advocating too strongly for any one thing. So what I'll do, though, is I'll dig up that issue right now. You all can move on to the next topic. And if anybody's passionate about my idea or has one of their own, go in that issue and start to pile on and upvote it. And that's how we'll win. That's how we'll win people over.
Yeah. If you want pile on to that, I'm trying to think if I've got it up here. And this is, we're getting way off topic, so I apologize about that to everybody else. But if you look at the retro board, which I think I can pull up really quickly here. This is the retro board with that model. Right. So if your choice is turn them all off, it seems like that's a really bad idea. But like removing one or two around that, when the case when you have 20.
Here's what I did. I was bored one evening, and by bored I mean I had important stuff to do that I was procrastinating. Oh, can you stop sharing and I'll jump in and reshare?
Yeah.
I found the issue. There we go. So I went in the Chrome Inspector and I just deleted all the labels and took a screenshot. So this is what the board looked like at the time with all the redundant gray and colored labels. And then without it, you can see, you only see the labels all of a sudden start to jump out at you. And you realize that oh, this is important. This one's important, etc. Had the effect that I was looking for, but I wasn't able to convince folks. So anyway, I'll put that issue in here, and if people want to upvote it, go for it, and maybe we'll change their minds.
Okay, cool. All right, and then I had an action item from last week. Just wanted to update that, which is training as a set of criteria. I talked to a couple of our directors, and they definitely would like their managers to be held accountable to the numbers. So we need a setup to basically push for training associated with that. So that doesn't change the actual document because we already had training as an item in there. And then the next one I had on there was this author versus org assignment debate that I think we had early on, where we talked about using either a group or some component to basically measure the number of people rather than doing it dynamically based on looking through the authors and then adding them up. I think I've convinced I've certainly convinced myself. I'm trying to convince the rest of the team that we really need to use the org assignment methodology here. Two key points. One, if you don't have the org assignment, the metrics you're looking at, like if you look at average MRs per month, average MRs per engineer per month, the reality is that you won't see that number grow because it's just highly dependent on when authors get involved. Because like if you had a high population at the end of the month who got involved and did a single MR for the month, you would actually see a decline in your average MRs per month associated with it. The other thing is it doesn't account for people outside the development organization who maybe aren't spending as much time. And if as that population grows, it's going to actually force us to be explaining that aspect of it, which is, hey, the rest of the population is growing, but they're not necessarily either held to the same metric or looked at in the same way from a productivity perspective. They're helping the product grow. That's a good thing. We don't want to discourage that. But by optimizing to average MRs per engineer without really being definitive about it, it makes the problem more difficult to look at. Mac, you're going to tell me the technical reason why we can't do this.
I don't think we have tracking in the product for this. Do we?
Well, you got members, right? Like you have developers and maintainers, right?
So if we keep a separate list to track the members and then plot it out in the chart, it could be possible. I'm also not sure. Yes, go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say, so Christopher, if I understand what you're saying is that like ideally we would have groups that represent these different product areas, and we would look at the average MR per this group, and then we would take on the burden of making sure people have the right group attached to them. I
Correct.
think my instincts are is that if it's not necessary to be in the right group, and if it's one and only one, therefore not in a number of groups, it's not necessary to have that to do your job. It's almost a hopeless battle to keep that up to date, because there's many similar things like our Google groups and other things that like we rely on our onboarding issues and people ops to do for us and managers, and like the compliance on that stuff is like 65% at best, which means this data would never be good. But what we could do that I would be a fan of is that if we tackle Dahlia's point up above about creating this synthetic notion of microservices in the code base, we just looked at those, that theoretically would never change. It would be a target and the code would always be going there. And I think then we would have 100% of the product covered, and that would be stable, and that would be much easier to keep up to date if we could solve that first problem of directories or files or something to say, this is the create code base in the monolith.
Yeah, I guess I'm less concerned about it on a per team basis. So that's a good point, because like the one thing I was distinguishing between was is overall organizational aspect versus team, and once you start getting into the team, it does get unwieldy from that perspective. So that's probably a good aspect to kind of call out. I think the thing that I'm trying to figure out is the way we actually decide by team is or by stage is by labeling, I think, as opposed to by any other method, right? So,
and Mac, what's your instinct on like how good a job we're doing as a company and historically on assigning things the right labels?
We're getting a lot better. We for one enforce singularity on stage labels now, and there's an effort by Remy to switch from group labels to use stage labels instead. So I think we should double down on that as a better accuracy than just team labels. And one thing that I would say is we are somehow double counting in some areas because we don't enforce one team label per MR. So that's not something I'm happy with. If we switch to use stage labels, then it will be improved, but it'll be pegged on the stage notion, not like an individual.
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, we're probably not good enough at this today to trust the data that come out of it. And even if we fix it, we're not going to have historical data.
Not accurate. We can try, but it won't be accurate because we will infer from a team level to reapply those stage labels. And if we run into two, we have to pick one or the other. And it might count to some other stage group, which is not accurate.
Yeah, so I'd be skeptical we have the data hygiene here to extract a lot of meaning from it. If we did, it would be
but it's also the major, like, it's the major countable number that we're being expected to be measured to, right?
Well,
so
you can see
I guess that's what I'm struggling with.
department, right? You're sort of advocating for your directors and managers to see their slice of it so they can be accountable to their number, right? Which I understand, but at least you can see your whole purview. I would bet on labels being easier to achieve than groups, because we've already got triage bots there. Like Mech, it seems like you might be able to enforce that one and only one rule for the bot. That gets us a little closer, you know what I mean?
Let me write this down. Oops.
My second point here is sort of like, if we solve cold fusion, we can definitely do this second thing. So I'm not saying that I necessarily have a better idea with the microservices thing.
Yeah, the reason I'm hesitant on the microservices, I think, well, you could argue that the microservices may be separate repos. Like that's actually how, like, one thing I haven't gone and looked at is like the distribution team works out of a separate repo. So by their very nature, are they more productive because they're in a much smaller repo, as an example?
Oh, that's a hypothesis.
It is. But what I'm more trying to figure out from a top level prioritization is just the fact of, hey, you're supposed to be trying to encourage people to contribute, but again, not everybody's job within the engineering organizations is to be 100% development all the time, all day long. And as those populations grow, what are our expectations around it from that perspective? And if you don't have some demarcation of it, it feels like it feels like we're not building a good measuring stick from that perspective. We have an idea about it. We can kind of dance around it, but it's definitely slice and dice the data every month to look at it to really figure out what's going on. But to your point, it's hard to solve the problem of tracking it accurately. So maybe I'll likewise for now. We'll see how things go. But I had the feeling that I have a feeling there's at least one customer, most likely government related, where they'd want to be very direct about who is working on what and what pieces of it, and those kinds of things.
Mike, is the tree sort of tangential to this? Is the triage bot part of the product, or is it separate and outside? Like, can customers use it? Users use it?
Yes, they can use it. Actually, some companies are already using it. It's a public project that anybody can just fork out and set up in their GitLab instance, and set up rules for the bot to do all these things.
Okay, so it's a separate project. It's not in the GitLab. If I just download and install GitLab, I don't get the ability to just go in and start configuring this thing.
Right. I do have an issue though, because I know we talked about it earlier before. The easiest way to get this is to open an integration at the project settings, and it's going to install this for you, and then you can define rules, and it's going to run on a CI runner for you. But yeah, there are plans to integrate it to make it easier, but we just don't have the time to work on it right now. I can find the issue for us.
Well, the way we said is it's not a high enough priority to work on it.
Yep. And before we leave this bullet item, I want to say that I have more confidence, if not a lot of confidence, at the data at the org level. I think that's accurate. It's not double counting. The day-to-day dashboards, the dashboards for each group are helping engineering managers to execute their day-to-day tasks, which is great. But we are indeed double counting in some areas if multiple labels are added to an MR or issues. So it hasn't been enforced yet.
Yeah, and that's where I'm more interested in the metric, to be honest, than at the individual teams or even at the stages necessarily. Because I think, if you read anything about story points as an example, like you'd expect them to vary heavily between groups of organizations. So then you have to kind of factor that in as well. MR is a little different from a complexity perspective, but it still wouldn't surprise me at all. Actually, the complexity levels of our engineers are varied. How
about this then? Like, very boring solution. We could enforce singularity on team labels right now on MR. If you can do that, would that help? And retroactively apply that, retroactively remove double counting labels on old MRs. That's like an MVC.
That helps with the labeling issue. I don't know if it gets to the average MRs per author issue. That's a population, right? Separate from the labeling issue.
Right. But yeah, it doesn't trickle to that level, of course.
Yeah.
And I don't think we want to do that at the average number, because that's going to hone down to a team or group. Because I thought we want to keep the average per developer at a very high level without pointing any fingers.
Well, I'm looking more at like numbers, right? So like as an example, I had 10 people to my organization, and I have a 100-person organization. You expect to increase by 10%, but that's only if the way we do average MRs per author the way it actually works out is that if I had 10 people in my organization and 5 other people get added to other organizations where they're, let's say those folks are going 10 MRs per month and the other groups are 2 MRs per month, I'm not going to grow 10%. I'm going to actually grow at a much smaller rate.
I see. Okay. That makes sense.
Right. So it's our distribution is getting more diverse.
So in the end goal for each group dashboard, do we want average MRs per that group eventually? That's what I'm getting here, correct? So that will help you with like slicing which area of the organization needs to bring up the average number.
Maybe. I think as a top level metric, I would immediately then look at throughput numbers for individual teams and then kind of go back and figure it out from there. I wouldn't necessarily look at average MRs. Like the only time you look at average MRs is when you're looking at the overall, whether you think the group as a whole is at the same level of productivity, you're getting more or less productive, right?
I still think enforcing singularity in the team now group labels will help because it will help with the throughput.
Okay.
Right? Because right now, if you add an MR, you have 2 labels, it will show in both teams' throughputs. So like at least we address that problem. And like now we have a discussion in MR, which team actually needs to apply this label. If they're just only reviewing, then they should be adding that label, the group label. So
I think in the interest of time, I'll be beaten into submission right now. So I do reserve the right to bring it back up in another month. Mick, do you have the next item?
Yes, this will be short. So after looking at the data with Tanya, we realized that we are potentially missing some data. But looking at the trend, I think even if we count that missing data, the trend will be the same. It's increasing. But we need to address label hygiene, and I'm proposing some really boring rules here to help with surfacing bugs faster, and it will involve some help from support as well. Right? For example, like there are issues that don't have a customer label. We can actually parse the issue description, do a regex match. If it has a Salesforce Zendesk link, go and automatically add a customer label if it's filed by a team member. If it has security, add a bug. There are issues with performance, but no bug label. There are issues with security, then no bug label. And there are issues with bugs, customer, and no severity. So I think these are boring solutions that we could do to help improve the hygiene. And yeah, I'm just gonna put it here for transparency, and we're gonna jump on this.
And if you need my support on it, let me know in any way.
Thank you.
From the perspective of if we find habitual non-labelers, we can have conversations.
Yep. And I found one with both bug and feature, and I'm like, is it a new feature or is it a bug? So that also needs to be enforced. So you can either pick one. It's either a bug or a feature. And thanks, Lai, for adding that as well. My next one. So I'm designing a new triage funnel process and potentially defining levels of triage completion. We have rolled out or agreed on at least the first iteration that the first level triage before it reaches engineering manager and PMs needs to have a team label, needs to have severity, needs to have a customer if applicable. So that's the process for that. I was looking to reinvigorate the engineering reaction rotation to enlist help. Right now, we've enlisted everybody in quality engineering to do this, and they're gonna work with their counterpart teams. But any help here is appreciated. And maybe we can take this offline as you decide how to remodel this process. And the second bullet item is the triage levels and the funnel that we are designing right now. So yeah, this is the first of the improving time to resolve bugs. This is just the first part, and we'll talk about how to schedule and then how to ensure fixes are being done fast later.
Okay. Cool. And then the last one I had is reviewing the exit criteria, which I will share the screen. So the big thing to note here is that we've expanded our exit criteria. So 20% increase in development department throughput, which I haven't done April's numbers, but we'll figure out how roughly we are doing there. We've got KPIs pretty close. We're basically level 3. Need to establish level 4 aspects to those maturities. And then training, we decided that we definitely need to do that from the perspective. And then we have a whole bunch that got added in the last week that we'll have to start tracking. So as part of creating the board, one of the things we'll do is take an action to create issues around these so that we can kind of have issues to track these exit criteria. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? Cool. Anything else to discuss? All right, thanks all.